The most successful advertising campaign in the history of the American government cost $10 and destroyed the lives of more families than any war the frontier had yet produced. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, promising any adult citizen 160 acres of free land on the Great Plains in exchange for a $10 filing fee and 5 years of continuous occupation and improvement. According to records analyzed by historians at the Kansas State Historical Society, the federal government promoted this arrangement as the foundation of a new agrarian democracy, a continent of independent farm families building prosperity from raw earth. What the promotional materials distributed by the General Land Office did not explain was the specific combination of soil chemistry, rainfall patterns, medical isolation, psychological pressure, and mathematical debt that waited on the other side of that $10 filing fee. By 1880, hundreds of thousands of families had staked claims across Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakota Territory, and eastern Colorado. The majority of them were living in conditions that no recruitment pamphlet had described and that most of them had not imagined possible when they signed the documents and pointed their wagons west. In this video, you will discover the specific engineering reason why the house a frontier family built from the ground itself was simultaneously the best and the worst shelter available on the plains. The documented medical reality of childbirth 2 days' ride from the nearest physician, the psychological condition that frontier doctors were diagnosing in women by 1880 with a name that has since been erased from most history books, and the exact percentage of homestead claims that were still active 5 years after filing. That last number will permanently change the way you read the phrase free land. To understand what a frontier family actually encountered in 1880, you first need to understand what they built to live in, because the structure of the shelter determined almost everything else about daily survival. The Great Plains in 1880 presented a landscape with one conspicuous material absence. There were no trees. Timber for construction, fuel, and tools had to be hauled from hundreds of miles away at prices that made a single load of lumber a significant financial event for a family operating on a homestead budget. The solution that necessity produced was the soddy, a house constructed from the prairie itself. According to construction records and homesteader accounts preserved in the collections of the Nebraska State Historical Society, a standard sod house was built by cutting the dense root-matted topsoil of the plains into bricks roughly 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, and 24 inches long, then stacking those bricks in alternating courses like masonry until walls 2 feet thick and 7 feet high enclosed a space typically measuring 16 by 20 feet. The entire structure, including the roof, which was laid sod over timber poles, was made of living earth. That construction had a specific thermal logic that was genuinely effective. Walls 2 feet thick provided insulation that no wooden frame house on the prairie could match. Interior temperatures in a properly built soddy remained relatively stable through both the 100-degree summers and the -30 winters that the Central Plains routinely delivered. On that single metric, the sod house outperformed every alternative a family with limited capital could afford. On every other metric, it was a structure that would today fail every housing code ever written. The roof leaked in rain, not occasionally and not in specific spots, but continuously, for hours after a storm ended, as the saturated sod above released its water in a steady indoor drizzle that soaked bedding, softened stored food, and turned the earthen floor into mud. Families placed pans on the table during meals in rainstorms to protect the food. Accounts collected by the journalist and historian Everett Dick, whose 1937 study, The Sod House Frontier, remains the most detailed reconstruction of Plains homestead life, describe women holding umbrellas indoors over their cooking fires. The ceiling, which was essentially a layer of compressed earth supported by wooden poles, was a habitat. Snakes entered from above and fell onto sleeping families. Insects of every kind, centipedes, beetles, spiders, and in summer, flies in densities that defied description in the letters "Homesteaders Sent Back East" lived in the walls and ceiling permanently. Mice nested in the sod and ran across faces in the dark. In wet springs, mushrooms grew on the interior walls. Can you picture putting your children to sleep in a room where snakes fall from the ceiling and you cannot get the floor dry? Because that is not a description of poverty by frontier standards. That is a description of a standard successful homestead in 1880. The question of water on the Central Plains was a daily physical crisis that consumed more labor than almost any other single task of frontier life. The surface water of the Great Plains, where it existed at all, was frequently alkaline, carrying dissolved mineral salts at concentrations that caused severe gastrointestinal illness when consumed regularly. Accounts from the Army Medical Department's surveys of frontier settlements, conducted through the late 1870s and compiled in reports now held by the National Archives, describe alkaline poisoning as one of the most consistent causes of sickness and livestock death across the region. The solution was a well, but drilling or digging a well on the plains was not a simple task. Depending on the location of the water table, a homestead well might require digging 30 feet or might require going down 200. Hiring a professional well driller in 1880 cost between $1 and $3 per foot in the Dakota Territory, according to contractor records cited by historian Gilbert Fite in his study The Farmer's Frontier. A 200-foot well represented a financial commitment that many families could not absorb in the first years of a homestead claim. Families without wells hauled water in barrels from the nearest creek or spring, which could be several miles distant, a round trip that consumed half a day of labor and the endurance of whatever draft animal the family owned. The draft animal itself was a critical economic variable that most promotional material about the Homestead Act omitted entirely. Breaking prairie sod for the first time required a breaking plow and at least 2, preferably 4, strong oxen or draft horses. The cost of a functional team and breaking plow in 1880 represented more money than many immigrant families had brought west. Families who could not afford adequate draft power broke their land slowly by hand, one small section at a time, and planted their first crops years behind the schedule that the 5-year prove-up requirement demanded. The Homestead Act required that a claimant cultivate a specified portion of the land and make permanent improvements within 5 years in order to receive title. A family that started with inadequate equipment was racing a legal deadline with tools that could not cover the ground fast enough. If you think the $10 filing fee was the real cost of a homestead claim, the actual financial entry price, including equipment, seed, food for the first non-producing year, well costs, and basic shelter materials, was estimated by contemporary agricultural economists at between $500 and $1,000 minimum. For a family emigrating from Eastern Europe or from the American South with limited capital, that gap between the advertised cost and the real cost was not a minor inconvenience. It was the margin between survival and destitution. Leave your like here if you were never taught in school what a homestead actually cost in 1880. The history that gets left out of the official story is exactly what this channel rebuilds. The labor structure of a frontier family in 1880 looks, from a modern perspective, like something that would generate immediate legal intervention. Children worked, not occasionally and not at light tasks, but continuously, from ages as young as 5 and 6, at physical labor that contributed directly to the family's survival. Accounts from homesteader diaries compiled by historian Joanna Stratton in her 1981 study, Pioneer Women, which drew on more than 800 first-person accounts from Kansas women, describe children driving teams, hauling water, collecting dried buffalo dung for fuel, watching younger siblings through entire working days, and performing agricultural tasks during planting and harvest seasons that left no hours for schooling. The schoolhouse, where one existed, was typically a sod structure several miles from the nearest claims, accessible only when the weather permitted travel and only when the child's labor could be spared at home. Average school attendance for frontier children in Kansas in 1880, according to state education records cited by Stratton, was fewer than 3 months per year. The specific labor burden on women deserves more attention than most frontier histories have given it, because the gap between what promotional material described as a woman's role on a homestead and what the actual daily schedule demanded was, by any honest accounting, one of the most severe misrepresentations in the entire narrative of westward expansion. A frontier woman in 1880 managed a household with no running water, no refrigeration, no fuel supply beyond what was hauled or collected, and no medical support infrastructure, while simultaneously contributing agricultural labor, managing the household's food preservation for winter, producing most of the family's clothing by hand, and delivering and raising children in conditions that made every pregnancy a statistically significant mortality risk. Childbirth on the frontier in 1880 meant exactly this. A woman in labor in a sod house, attended by a neighbor woman if one lived close enough to be reached in time, by her husband if not, with no physician within a distance of 50 miles in many sections of the Dakota Territory in western Kansas. The specific obstetric emergencies that trained physicians could address, malpresentation, hemorrhage, prolonged labor, were death sentences in conditions where the nearest medical help was a 2-day ride away. Maternal mortality rates on the frontier, while difficult to calculate precisely from incomplete records, were substantially higher than in eastern cities, and the accounts in Stratton's Pioneer Women include dozens of first-person descriptions of women who died in childbirth, of women who survived births that killed their infants, and of women who lost multiple children before a single one survived to adulthood. The psychological weight of that accumulated loss, combined with the specific sensory deprivation of life on the open plains, produced a condition that frontier physicians were documenting by name in the 1870s and 1880s. They called it prairie madness. The accounts recorded in medical journals of the period and analyzed by historian Annick Smith in her work on Great Plains women's experience describe a pattern of symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as severe depression combined with acute anxiety and dissociative episodes. Women who had grown up in the forests of Germany, the river valleys of Bohemia, or the wooded hills of the American South arrived on the open plains and encountered a horizon with no vertical interruption for distances that the eye could not resolve. The wind never stopped. In winter, the sound of the wind against the sod house was continuous, a low, sustained pressure that many accounts describe as the sound most closely associated with psychological deterioration. Women who had been socially active in the communities they left behind spent months in a soddy seeing no one outside their immediate family, covering distances to the nearest neighbor that made a casual visit a half-day expedition. The rates of commitment to the territorial asylum at Yankton, South Dakota, spiked sharply in the winter months of the 1880s, and a disproportionate number of those commitments were women from isolated homestead claims. Here is something the history books almost never say directly. The frontier did not break weak people. It broke people systematically through specific combinations of isolation, physical exhaustion, grief, debt, and sensory monotony that would have produced a psychological damage in any human being regardless of character or resilience. The women who survived it intact were not tougher than the women who did not. They were luckier in ways that had nothing to do with personal strength. The natural threats that a frontier family faced in 1880 arrived with a randomness that no preparation could fully address. Prairie fires moved faster than a horse could run under the right wind conditions, and on the open plains those wind conditions were routine. A fire starting miles away could reach a homestead in under an hour, consuming the dry grass of the surrounding range before any defensive action was possible. Families who survived prairie fires described a wall of orange flame visible from miles away, the smell of smoke arriving long before the heat, and the specific terror of watching the fire jump fire breaks that had taken days to clear. Many did not survive. The records of the General Land Office contain thousands of abandoned claims where the listed reason for abandonment is fire, and where the subsequent fate of the filing family is simply unrecorded. Grasshoppers arrived without warning and left behind stripped landscapes. The Rocky Mountain locust swarms of 1874 and 1875, which agricultural historians at the University of Nebraska have called the largest locust events in recorded North American history, consumed crops across the Central Plains in a matter of hours, leaving families who had successfully grown their first substantial harvest with empty fields and no food reserve for the coming winter. The insects ate not only the crops, but wooden tool handles, leather harnesses, and the wool clothing hanging on laundry lines. Families who had spent 2 years building towards self-sufficiency were returned to complete dependence on credit and emergency food shipments from Eastern relief organizations in the span of a single afternoon. The final accounting of the Homestead Act, the number that the General Land Office did not advertise and that most popular histories of the period still underreport, is this. According to analysis published by historian Paul Gates in his study, History of Public Land Law Development, fewer than 40% of the original homestead claims filed between 1862 and 1900 were successfully proved up and converted to full title. The majority of filings were abandoned, cancelled for non-compliance, or transferred under foreclosure before the 5-year period ended. The free land that the government had promised was free only to the fraction of families whose combination of capital, weather, health, and endurance happened to align with the specific demands of 5 consecutive Plains years. For the majority, the Homestead Act was a one-way ticket to a place from which returning east was too expensive, and proving up was mathematically impossible. The families who did prove up, who held on through the fire years and the grasshopper years and the blizzard years and the debt years and the death years and finally received their title, were not living the life the promotional pamphlets had described. They were living a life that those pamphlets had made necessary by attracting more families than the land could support, at a scale of hardship that no honest recruiter could have advertised and expected anyone to come. The frontier of 1880 was not a place where the American character was tested and found strong. It was a place where a government land policy, an inadequate information infrastructure, and an agricultural economy built on optimistic assumptions about rainfall and markets produced an enormous human experiment whose failure rate was quietly buried in the abandoned claim records of county courthouses from Kansas to the Dakotas. The specific economic mechanism that trapped families on claims they could not successfully prove up deserves more attention than most frontier histories give it, because it reveals how the promise of free land functioned in practice as a credit delivery system for equipment suppliers, seed merchants, and railroad companies rather than as a genuine wealth transfer to settlers. A family that arrived on a claim with limited capital immediately required credit to purchase the equipment and seed the first season demanded. The nearest source of that credit was typically the local merchant in the nearest railroad town, who extended accounts at interest rates that reflected the risk of lending to unproven farmers on unproven land. By the time a family had survived 2 or 3 years and was approaching the prove-up deadline, the accumulated debt to the local merchant, combined with any mortgage taken against future crop proceeds, frequently exceeded the market value of the land they were about to receive title to. Receiving the patent on 160 acres in 1880 did not mean owning 160 acres free and clear. It meant owning the legal right to land that a merchant in town or a loan company in Chicago held a lien against. The families who arrived poorest left poorest, regardless of how hard they had worked or how successfully they had broken the sod and planted the crops and held on through the bad years. The Homestead Act transferred enormous quantities of public land into private hands between 1862 and 1900. The evidence that it transferred wealth to the families who actually homesteaded it is considerably less convincing. The sod houses are gone now. most of them dissolved back into the earth they were made from within a generation of being abandoned, which is what sod houses do when no one is there to repair the roof after a rainstorm. In certain fields in western Kansas and the Nebraska sandhills, you can still find the rectangular depressions where the floor used to be, a slight hollowing of the ground that the grass has not fully filled in after a century and a half. If you know what you are looking at, you can read the size of the rooms, the placement of the door, the distance to where the well was dug. Everything else is grass. If this video showed you a frontier that was harder, more specific, and more honest than anything you learned in school, subscribe to the channel. Every week, we rebuild a world that the official version left out. And click on the screen now to watch how the cattle drives of the 1870s actually operated, and why the cowboys who rode them were some of the most economically vulnerable workers in the entire American West.